Well, Ridley Scott's film *The Martian* is a wonderfully told tale of pluck and survival. Reminded me in many ways of *Life of Pi* or *Castaway*, or go back further to a novel like *Robinson Crusoe*. And those stories are always kind of compelling. The hero in this case is Mark Watney, who's a NASA astronaut with a team on Mars. And as the movie opens up, this great storm has descended, and Watney is sort of swept away, and the crew presumes he's dead, and they have to leave, so off they go. And he's left stranded, like Robinson Crusoe on Mars. And so the story unfolds as his very bold attempt to survive. And he's very smart, he's very plucky, he's got a good sense of humor, a good sense of himself, and he applies his scientific mind to the problem. And he manages to produce water through this scientific method. He, through creative fertilizing, is able to grow an impressive crop of potatoes, and he survives over the course of many years. In many ways, the movie is a sort of encomium to the power of science. At one point, he's facing this difficult situation, and he goes, well, I'm just going to have to science the blank out of this. And so we see him applying his scientific knowledge in a very creative way. Well, eventually NASA discovers through surveillance photography that he has in fact survived. He's still alive. And now the movie is an exploration of how they're going to get this man back. And basically they move heaven and earth to do so. The original crew returns, and NASA applies all of its knowledge, and they endeavor to get Mark Watney back. The movie ends with the now somewhat grizzled Watney some years later lecturing a group of prospective astronauts. And he basically lays out this thing like, you solve problem after problem after problem, and if you do that enough times, you get to go home. And so there's the film is, the power of science, the power of the application of scientific knowledge. But I want to address something which is, I think, implicit throughout the movie, but it's rarely attended to. We rarely think it through adequately. Why in the world would people move heaven and earth to rescue this one guy? Why in the world would you spend probably $1 billion, I don't know how much they spent, but let's say hundreds of millions or billions of dollars to bring this one person home? Let's say a very clever and well-trained dog had been left up on Mars. He's part of the crew. The space dog had been left behind. Well, people would have, I'm sure, regretted it, and they would have felt bad about it, but no one would have moved heaven and earth to bring the dog back from Mars. But they do it in the case of this astronaut. How come? How come? See, we take it for granted. Well, of course you do that. But why, of course? Well, the biblical answer, and I would say it still haunts our civilization, even though we've largely turned away from the Bible, at least many parts of our civilization. The biblical answer is, there's a qualitative and not merely quantitative difference between human beings and other animals. We are not just an extremely clever ape, but rather we've been made in the image and likeness of God. There's something unique about human beings. Now, as our tradition has examined that biblical testimony, it's seen it in terms of our spiritual powers, especially of intellect and will. Now, with this movie in mind, let me focus on that first one, intellect. Our intelligence is seen as an indicator that we were made in the very image and likeness of God. Now, what is it precisely about our intelligence? Well, like other animals, we have the capacity to see the world, to take it in through our senses, to raise it in imagination, to remember it. Animals can do that. Dogs remember things. So what's distinctive about human knowing? It's precisely the capacity for abstract thought, to entertain those fundamental patterns that ancient and medieval philosophers called the forms. The form is not something physical so much, it's a pattern that makes something what it is. Well, the mind, in its capacity to entertain a form, shows itself to be more than merely physical, more than merely material. A purely material brain can indeed form an image. It can hang on to a memory. But the mind capable of holding on to a properly formal reality is itself beyond the merely material. Who saw this very clearly was Plato in his famous parable, The Cave. Most of us, these are like people chained inside a cave, seeing shadows flickering on the wall. What that refers to is our experience of this passing evanescent world, the world of the senses, the world that comes and goes, the world that can be seen with eyes and remembered by brains. But then Plato says, some people have the capacity to escape from the cave, to come out into the fullness of light and to see things as they really are. What is that but the mind's capacity through philosophical reason to come to see the forms, the enduring patterns that are greater than, more lasting than, the evanescent images of the world. Plato saw this very clearly, that when you know that 2 + 3 = 5, and you're not just seeing 2 things and 3 things and then seeing them together, but rather you've grasped the essential truth, the formal truth, the pattern of 2 + 3 being equal to 5. When you've grasped that, you have in a very real sense left this world. You have in a very real sense left the world of passing imagery, and you've entered a new world, the world of the forms. And what that witnesses to, in Plato's view, is the immateriality of the mind, how the mind participates in a higher mode of being. This is the image and likeness of God, what links us to a higher and more spiritual world. Now, here's a link I want to make with the Martian film in mind. The very thing that the Martian celebrates, namely scientific reason, this capacity for properly abstract thought. And see, abstract thought runs right through all the sciences. The sciences begin in the senses. They begin with experimentation, but they are conditioned at every level by abstract thinking. The very thing that makes the sciences possible and worthy of celebration is this distinctively human way of knowing. This spiritual capacity that makes us more than merely clever animals, that makes people willing to move heaven and earth to save a human life. See, I think it's very important in a time when, as Pope Francis points out, we have a throwaway culture of dispensability. Human beings, if they get in the way, either unborn human beings or human beings at the end of life, well, get rid of them. Assisted suicide, abortion, euthanasia, why not? It's a throwaway culture. But see, Christianity, with its roots in the Bible, stands athwart the throwaway culture and says, no, every individual human life is of unsurpassed dignity, precisely because of this image and likeness to God. I would argue, even though it's never explicitly argued as such, but all the way through this movie, that difference has to be assumed.